Okay, I'm going to kick off. There's 100 or so that have joined on Zoom and then more on Facebook. So I'm sure more will join as the call goes on. It's raining and there really is nothing better to do than to listen to all of these incredible people. Absolutely so pleased and excited to be joined by so many incredible people from across the progressive movement on this call. Can I just ask that everyone mutes themselves when they're not speaking? Is that okay? Sorry. Okay, great. So thank you to our speakers for joining us this evening, and thank you to those who are joining us on Zoom or on Facebook Live. When the team and I were talking last week, we were actually discussing various different struggles, and we kind of came to the conclusion that we really do need to have an event that brings people together on Black Lives Matter, on climate, on the workers' struggle, on what's happening with very ugly transphobia that has got much worse in recent years, and also to really think about where we go from here across the trade union movement as well. And so glad as well to be joined with Asad from Asad Rahman from War on Want to talk about the international effort that needs and the international connections between what's happening here and elsewhere in the world. I'm just aware that maybe I'm not being pinned to the call right now. I don't know if it's just my screen. Thank you to Lester who's doing our technical stuff. We haven't done it quite this way before. There you go. I didn't wear this bright green shirt for nothing. Okay, great. So we're going to kick off because we've got so many incredible speakers, but I just, and there will be time for Q&A. I'm asking people to type their Q&A in the Q&A section, and really to think about this time and what it means for those of us on the left who obviously have had a really hard time in the last 6 months. And you know, it really struck me yesterday when I was listening to Rishi Sunak's mini budget or summer statement, that we are being massively shortchanged at this time, that when we should have a new deal, we're getting a meal deal. And it's just a very frustrating time. And I think, you know, you would have seen, those of you that have been on Twitter today, there's a lot of discussion about cancel culture and all the typical right-wing, bordering on racist or actually racist people on Twitter wasting our time and our energy. And what I really want today's call to be about is what we actively need to be doing. And, you know, it is difficult that we don't have the same sort of progressive leadership of the Labour Party that we had last year. So some of us, and, you know, this is a personal choice, some of us are looking to where else to put our efforts and our activism. And I can't think of a better group of people to give us advice and guidance on what we should be doing, where we should be focusing, because of course this isn't a time to give up, this is a time to fight harder. So I'm going to kick off and hand over to Satbir Singh, who's the Chief Executive of JCWI, and he's going to talk us through some of what's happening on immigration, and in particular what we should be fighting for on that issue, which is an issue, unfortunately, that we have not done a good job on ever, I don't think. So Satbir, I'm handing over to you. Thanks.
Hi, thanks Faiza for organising this, and to everyone at class, and thanks for having me. Essentially, you're right, there is nothing better to do on a really miserable rainy evening than this. So obviously it goes without saying it's been a pretty tough few months for lots of people. The pandemic's been a pretty ghastly experience across the board, but as we've all kind of heard through the news, through studies, through social media, Black and minority ethnic communities have been hit particularly hard by the pandemic, both in terms of the immediate medical effects of it, so the loss of life has been greater, access to healthcare has been much lower, and the economic effects of the pandemic and what's about to hit us will most likely also be felt more strongly by those communities. The majority of people in the UK who are not British born are Black or minority ethnic, and the majority of migrants or non-British people, or the majority of Black and minority ethnic people in Britain are also migrants. And if you have any status, if you have any form of paperwork that's short of citizenship or short of indefinite leave to remain, then you almost definitely also have no recourse to public funds. Most people in the country, including, surprisingly, the Prime Minister, were quite shocked to find out about this policy when he was asked about it in committee last month. It's been on the statute books for over 20 years, and the net effect of it is that if you don't have indefinite leave to remain, you have no form of access to any public subsidy or support. So if you're one of the millions of people whose job, the type of work you're doing, whether you're on a 0 hours contract, whether you're doing casual or flexible work, whether you're just doing kind of work that gets paid in cash under the table, or you're an agency worker, or you just don't fit into the neat boxes that Rishi Sunak put out there in his job retention scheme, it meant that for the last 3-4 months, you've had zero safety net. There has been nothing to catch you, and you've had no support whatsoever during the shutdown. The effect of that, from what we've seen in our work, has been twofold. First, we've just seen growing numbers of people who've become destitute, homeless, slipping under the tide of poverty. And we're talking here about people whose heads were just above the water before the crisis hit. And I mean, at JSWI, we've had to do things that we in 53 years have never had to do as an organisation, from like posting formula milk to people at home, to renting out hotel rooms because of the sheer number of people who have just slipped under that tide as it's washed over, and there's been nothing to rescue them. It's bad, there's no two ways about it, and it could have been avoided because there were call after call after call for some of these policies to be removed. The second impact of that kind of lack of safety net for people is that people will have been working throughout the lockdown, even when it was probably dangerous for them or for their families or even for their communities to do it. And that's simply because they had no other way to feed themselves or feed their family. And that necessity to put yourself or your family at risk was born entirely out of the fact that there's no safety net and has been deliberately legislated by successive governments. If you're undocumented, those challenges are exponentially harder. Not only is there no access to the job retention scheme, no recourse to public funds, there isn't even a right to work, which doesn't mean that people aren't working, because you've got to put food on the table at the end of the day. It just means that people aren't working safely. So we've encountered agency workers working in the care sector or working in warehouses or supermarkets who haven't been given PPE, who are getting paid below the minimum wage. They're working double shifts, 16 hours a day, and there's literally nowhere they can turn to because their employer could shop them to the Home Office. They can't go to the police, they can't go to a union because, again, the next day their door could be knocked down by immigration enforcement. And when they felt symptoms, they couldn't even go to the doctor because the Home Office has open door access to all NHS data, which means you turn up at your GP and your door could be knocked down and you could be detained tomorrow. So when you think about who's had a good pandemic, it's been rogue employers, it's been traffickers, it's been people who prey on that kind of desperation and vulnerability. And we don't know all the details yet of what's gone on in Leicester, but if you've got a situation like that where people are crammed into fast fashion warehouses and they're being forced to work in dangerous conditions with peanuts for pay, and they can't complain because of the hostile environment, they can't go to the police, they can't go to a union, they can't go to a doctor if they've got symptoms, it's pretty predictable what's going to happen. And the blame for that lays squarely at the door of the government, who are warned that this would happen. And that does point us to what we need to fix and what we need to fight for. So a lot of us on the left have said consistently over the last few months that there's no point standing on your door and clapping for doctors and nurses if you're not also clapping for and fighting for shelf stackers and bus drivers and cleaners and porters and workers at every level of our society, whose dangerous and thankless work has kept this island afloat for the last 4 months. And at the end of the day, people can't eat applause. Workers need a new deal. They need proper protections in the workplace, decent wages and rights. And when we ask for those things, we need to centre migrant workers in those conversations, because migrant workers also need the right to work safely, whatever their immigration status, to be able to report exploitation and dangerous conditions without fear of their door being knocked down and their house being raided the next day. And that means keeping sanctions on exploitative employers, but decriminalising the act of working. It means lifting and dismantling the hostile environment. It means lifting restrictions on the safety net so that you don't have to work if it's dangerous, and that means lifting no recourse to public funds. And these fights are important, they're not marginal. For the left, that means that we can't buy into the myth that some workers' rights are different from other workers' rights, that workers' rights and migrants' rights are somehow opposed to each other. We all know that the denial of decent wages and decent, safe conditions for one group of workers is a threat to every other group of workers. And you can see in, like, our other brilliant speakers tonight are going to talk more about this, I'm sure, but the attempts by the government and by the right to lean into these, what they're calling culture war debates, are a deliberate attempt to keep us distracted from the fact that they have ballsed up the last 4 months and they have left 1 in every 1,000 people dead. And they're doing it again. They're moving on things like asylum, on evictions of undocumented workers. They're trying to tighten the border, tighten the screws on people who've kept this island afloat. And as long as we let them do that, we won't really see progress against any of the other things that we want to see as well, because it's a classic divide and rule strategy that's worked for them for years, and we can't let them do it this time.
Great, thanks Sabir. Thank you. I think one of the things that will come out in this call is where the gaps lie. So I just want to come back to you quickly, and just for people on the phone that are thinking, that on this call, in this meeting, that are thinking, yeah, I actually don't know enough about what's going on the grounds for immigration, and it sounds awful. Have you got just any tips on what they should be looking at and how they can be getting involved?
So there's a ton of organisations and groups out there. I mean, you can visit our website, chasewy.org.uk. If you go to our the COVID pages on our website, it will also direct you to dozens of other organisations all over the country. The Unity Project is challenging the no recourse to public funds condition. Groups like We Belong are challenging the restrictions on young people accessing citizenship, which has blocked them from accessing support this time as well. There's a ton of activity out there. Best place to find it is, if you go to our website, if you look at the COVID microsite, we can point you in the right direction, and there's a ton of information about the policy risks there as well.
Great, thank you, Sabir. Just gonna, I'm not sure, I think Clive is still on the train, so I might just hold back on bringing him in right now. Gary, if I can come to you, I mean, one of the things that has really struck me about what's happened on Black Lives Matter here versus in the US, and speaking to a lot of my activist friends in the US, is the way in which it very quickly got reduced down to a conversation about statues, and also was brought into this very ugly culture war. And I think that's one of the themes that unites a lot of the speakers tonight. We're all on the right side of the culture war, but unfortunately means that we get a lot of trolls and harassment. So yeah, Gary, I'm going to let you speak about where you think we should be focusing right now, and what it is where we can put our energies.
Yeah, I think that we're in a very crucial moment with what's gone on over the last month, which is that we have been necessarily kind of focused on forms of symbolism, really. You know, we've taken a knee, we've raised a fist. There've been issues with statues, and I think it's important not to dismiss that. People are very quick to say, well, you know, what is that? But actually kind of, those are quite important kind of galvanizing things. Large numbers of people who haven't thought about this before, haven't thought about it in quite the same way, have kind of have come out, and that actually symbols are quite important. And but they shouldn't be mistaken for substance. And so the next step then is to kind of push in other ways. We're not going to be marching every single day, right? So then to push in other ways for the kind of concrete demands that will make our lives better. And one of what we are seeing is that one of the big differences between us and the States, and I think this is true elsewhere in Europe, is that we don't have the centuries-old organizations with the institutions and the structures that can kind of hold this. And now this is actually kind of not particular to anti-racist struggles. I think the left has proved itself much more capable of clearing space than holding it and building on it. And I think in this, there's a risk that we do that again. We have shown that there is this quite significant constituency for anti-racist struggle, a constituency that frankly hasn't really been tapped in a way that it should have been. But the challenge is whether we have the capacity, and as a Black community at the moment, I don't think we do have the capacity to actually now take those people who have been galvanized and and keep this moment moving, if you see what I mean, sustain the energy that has been created, which that's nobody's fault. It's a critique of where we are as a kind of as a group of people who've not been in the country very long, who don't have a huge amount of institutional support from any particular political party, which have built institutions, but that kind of those institutions often last a generation and then fade, and then you got to build another one. And I don't think it's particular to the Black communities either. I think we've seen that with Occupy and a bunch of other things where, you know, there's a galvanizing, there's a convening, and then there is a dissolution, and then we regather in some other space. I think what the last, well, just to row back, actually, I think that we have to connect this with COVID and the disproportionate likelihood that we will be struck by COVID and died from COVID, and the way in which that went from anecdotal to kind of visual. People would see on the television, 8 doctors have died, and you're like, hang on, you know, there's something that's connecting all of those doctors. And the connection really is between the kind of banal and the brazen. In the vicious stop and search, and in the case of George Floyd, you have the most nasty, clear morality play, the man with the badge and the uniform killing in one case, but in other cases that we've seen more recently, harassing. And it's a moment that you can share and click and be outraged by immediately. And what you have with COVID is the kind of more humdrum, actually more deadly experience of racism being the most likely to be shoved to the bottom of most piles. So who's in the worst housing, who's in the most cramped housing, who has to work, as Satbir was saying, who has to work, who are the nurses, who are the bus drivers, who are the security guards, who are the taxi drivers. We are the key workers, not only us, but kind of largely us and migrants, and we're the most vulnerable. And so there is this connection between the banal and the brazen. The everyday quotidian kind of experience of racism isn't a cop putting a knee on your neck or whatever. It's kind of it's someone messing with the rota and putting you, you know, in the worst shift, and somebody, you know, it's people shuffling around papers and not thinking, I'm going to make sure you get COVID. I know that there have been a couple of cases of people spitting on people, but by and large, it's not the virus that discriminates, it's society that discriminates, and it puts us in the most vulnerable situation. Coming back to kind of Black Lives Matter, there has been, notwithstanding the symbolism, a kind of opportunity for a historical reckoning that has been taken. There's no new information about Rhodes or Colston or Baden-Powell, all of whom statues either come down or are coming down. It's not that they suddenly realised that Rhodes was a big head. It's that he's more of a liability now up than he is down. We've changed the terms. Well, the terms have been changed anyway. And that's no small thing when you think of the small number of quite young people who have been organising around this. And it's really vital, if we are going to kind of have a meaningful conversation about anti-racism that engages everyone, that there is some historical awareness, that there is some British people, white British people will say, we won the World Cup, even if they didn't play, even if they weren't born. They'll say, we won the war, even if they didn't fight. But no one will say, we colonized people, we raped women, we tortured people. And so the power that comes with the kind of in Great Britain always has a lot of parents, but the brutality that it took to acquire it is always an orphan. And in these last few weeks, we've seen a reckoning, and we've seen a constituency that's ready for the reckoning. Now, sadly, that constituency does not yet include the Labour leadership, and that has been disappointing. I don't know what I was expecting, but it wouldn't have been hard. In fact, it would have been better and more in keeping with the kind of Mr. Forensic, above it all kind of status that Keir Starmer is trying to acquire, if he were to kind of make actually a kind of substantial speech and say, the country's done great things, we've done terrible things, we have to be big enough to recognise that kind of, you can't just cheer black people when they're playing football for you, singing for you, running for you. You have to ask yourself why they do so well in these areas where the rules are known and the playing field's level, but in these other areas where the rules are more obscure and the playing field is tilted, they don't do so well. There's a speech that he could make, but instead for him to dismiss Black Lives Matter, for him to dismiss the kind of the issue of defund the police rather than explain it, which is basically a public health approach to kind of welfare, that if you talk to police, they will tell you that they're spending half of their time, well, not half their time, but substantial amount of their time dealing with kids who should be in school, but they've been excluded or they've been off-rolled, that they are kind of dealing with people who have mental health challenges and aren't being seen, that they're dealing with kind of homeless people. These aren't police matters. And he's either intelligent enough to know what defund the police means and explain it, or he doesn't know what he means and he's in the wrong job. And either way, he kind of stood, not openly, but I would say kind of clearly the aim was to be the kind of Corbyn's exorcist. And it's not clear what is going in its place. And yet the situation that he seeks to occupy is not or sought to occupy, is not the situation that exists now.
Yeah.
We've had a pandemic, we're about to have a depression, and there's been this massive anti-racist awakening, and he is not meeting it. And so, and I'll end here, that kind of, once again, I feel the Labour leadership, not in previous years, but kind of historically, this has been their lot, is that they understand that racism is bad. I think they do get that. They have a crude understanding of what it is, but they understand it's bad. But they haven't yet understood that anti-racism is good, and that anti-racism is the antidote to racism, and that without anti-racism, what you get is fine words and terrible policies. And that's particularly disappointing because we need to build the capacity of this fledgling movement. And so it's sad when it is not just ignored, but actively dismissed by the leader of an organization who could who could act in solidarity.
Thanks, Gary. I mean, it's always, I always feel a little bit smarter after listening to you. And, you know, we all miss your weekly columns, although we can find you in various different places now, including the Financial Times. But it does, you know, and let me be honest about this, really, the reason we're doing this event is because the team and I were incredibly upset last week with what Keir Starmer said. It felt like we have lost that progressive space, and really thinking about how class and other organisations can you know, bring the community together. There are so many of us that feel this way, and there has to be places for us still to go and to organise and to think about what's next. And whilst we need to push within the Labour Party as well, and there are still incredible individuals, and Clive is hopefully listening in on the train, and just want to shout out Dawn Butler, because her constituency office has been attacked, and various things going on there, to the extent that she's had to close her office. And that is how difficult it is to talk out about racism these days. You get not just the attacks online, but there's also a physical threat as well. And that's how bad things have become. And so any of our struggles, anything of what we do, anti-racism must sit at its heart. So thank you for that, Gary. I'll come back to you in a bit when there's more questions, but I'm gonna go to, I don't know if, Clive, can you speak now? I just can't.
Yeah, I can. And I've actually been listening to the whole thing on the journey back, and I've got home, so I am here. Just
great. Well, I'm going to hand over to Clive, the Labour MP for Norwich. I'm going to hand over to you.
Do you want to tee me up with a question to get me going? That always helps.
It's really falling off. You got the beat, right? It's really coming from what Gary just said there about what's going on in the Labour Party, and I know it's actually quite painful to see, but really where you think that the left should be focusing its efforts, both inside the party but also outside of the party too.
That's it.
What we don't want is for people to walk away from the progressive struggle. You know, all of the young people that were texting me last week and getting in touch with me that said, I got involved with politics because of Jeremy Corbyn, and now the Labour Party doesn't have my back anymore. I don't know what I'm going to do. You know, we need to, I'm asking you to give.
Yeah, and I mean, just on that point, I mean, I think that was always let's just try and get some of the negatives out of the way. I mean, I think that was always a problem for Corbynism, in that, you know, there was a choice early on about whether the left focused on an individual, i.e. Jeremy, or it tried to move away from that and more of a movement, more of a kind of an idea and a program, if you want. And it kind of vacillated. And in the end, it settled on Jeremy. And I think that's problematic, because once that person's gone, you know, I saw it and I knew it was coming. That once they've gone, because it was focused on an individual, it meant that a lot of people said, well, he's gone. I came into politics because of Jeremy. But it wasn't, you know, rather than I came into politics because of the politics or because of the movement or because of, and I think we fed into that trap. And given what we know about what the media, what the establishment will do to every single Labour leader, especially those that challenge the status quo, then, you know, we saw that coming, and there were those who warned against it. But that was that. The other thing I want to say, which is probably, you know, may not go down well with listeners, is I don't want to put the last Labour leadership on a pedestal. You know, you have to ask some hard questions. Jeremy had a very warm relationship with the Black and ethnic minority community. You could see that when Jeremy opened up his office to various different Black and ethnic minority groups on different days. Jeremy had a long history of engaging with particularly the Black community, the Asian community, but BAME community in general. And he was very well known for that. You could feel the warmth in the room. You never experienced that anywhere else, I don't think, in my time in the party, where I feel BAME people, Black people especially, had a warmth for Jeremy. He just kind of stood up and spoken out, which is why I think the kind of anti-Semitism was like, people were like, well, what do you mean? This guy is, you know, on the forefront of anti-racism, anti-imperialism. But then you have to kind of, it was a kind of, on another level, it was difficult in the sense that there's someone who was never a massive fan of the European Union and the bureaucracy of it, and understood the kind of where Europe got its wealth from, where it comes from, the whole history of it, gets all of that. At the end of the day, I also knew that the anti-Brexit forces didn't. Many black people knew that this wasn't going to end well for us, and I think there was a kind of spider sense that we had that the forces behind Brexit were not healthy forces for black and ethnic minority people in particular, and for our class in particular. And yet we know there was an opportunity for the left to engage on those cultural issues around Brexit, and we refused to. We refused to acknowledge that at the core of a big component that the Tories hoped deliberately, consistently through the Brexit campaign and after, there was a racist dimension to it. I got ridiculed on national media for daring to suggest in front of Labour Party colleagues that there was a racist dimension to Brexit. It was, are you mad? And of course there was, of course there was. And yet I don't think Corbynism wanted to tackle that. And I think it went on a purely economistic approach, i.e. if we make you an offer to make your life better economically, that will be enough. But it didn't tackle the cultural dimension. And, there are people in the leadership election who after that said, we don't want to enter, Lisa and Andy, we don't want to touch the culture war. Well, we haven't got a choice. Culture war has been happening to us for 400 years. Yeah, the culture war was declared 400 years ago. We haven't got a choice in that. And I think the party is waking up to the fact, yes, the Tories are pushing buttons, throwing hand grenades in and sitting back and going, oh, look at that. But we can't run away from that because because the party consists of all of those different identities, those groups, that intersectionalism. So I think one of the roles for black MPs, black members, I say black and ethnic, I want to say black, but BAME members, BAME MPs, and myself and Kate Osborne and others in the BAME PLP are moving towards this, is that let us lead this conversation on a 21st century British identity. And I think we can't get away from that. If Keirism is, it doesn't exist yet, but we're kind of picking out bits of it. Some of it we don't like, but I think that what they're trying to construct is what I would call a kind of 21st century inclusive faith, family, and flag. I mean, someone like Claire Ainsley now might shoot me for saying that, but it does. I do get the feeling from the bits of her book that I've read, from what I've been able to pick up, that there are these pressures on the leadership to kind of go down this route and to kind of encapsulate, everyone from Tory swing voters, Jeremy Clarkson, those Labour swing voters in the Red Wall, all the way over to people who are more socially liberal or black in the party or voters, and to try and forge a new working class identity and move that forward. I think that was the project. I think the Black Lives Matter and George Floyd has made that a lot more difficult, as we've seen over the last few weeks. What do I think about what Keir said and how he's responded? I've spoken to him. I've said he knows. I've said he's let himself down. He's let black people down. He's got a lot of work to do. What do I think about the unconscious bias training for all MPs on the issue of race? I think, fine, it's a start. But as I said to Keir yesterday when I spoke to him about this, not meaning to name drop there, but I did. I said, you can't do this in isolation. You've got to show the black and ethnic minority community that you understand structural racism, that you understand the fact that we wouldn't have an NHS, we wouldn't have a welfare state unless it was for the three founding pillars of capitalism: genocide, slavery, and colonialism. You've got to let people understand that you know this, and that you are also, as a leadership, prepared to erode the power of capital, because that is why this is all coming about, why it's all here. That is the basis. And if you're not even prepared, I mean, there are people in our party and people outside of it on the left who want to overthrow capital. Great, but and brilliant. Structurally, that's the font of so much of the ills that we're experiencing. It's killing the planet. It's killing all of us. It's eroding our democracy. We're seeing the rise of fascism. And I think the bare minimum is, are you prepared? Whichever party you're in, whichever kind of progressive outfit you're in, inside the Labour Party or out, are you prepared to erode the power of capital? And if you could answer that, then I think you can take a step in the right direction. And that inevitably also, not inevitably, but can mean that you are prepared to be anti-racist and act in that way. So I think one of the roles for the Black PLP, which is being hopefully established, there has been some pushback from MPs who would rather we stayed as a WhatsApp group and met up for a meal once or twice a year. I shit you not, but that's the position of some in the PLP, and that we have the ear of Keir now. I'm not in that camp. I think that black MPs, ethnic minority MPs, Asian MPs, they need to have a formal structure inside the PLP, because if we don't, we're forever going to be a footnote, an afterthought. And I think now more than ever, I think after the death of George Floyd and the rise of Black Lives Matter, and the fact that people saw that extra added dimension to race in so many ways, I saw it in my members, particularly locally in Norwich. I think people now see that it's essential. I think the other thing I will just kind of finish on is it was really interesting what Gary was saying about COVID. And I think COVID, it does, I mean, the disease isn't racist, but it does highlight perfectly the disease of racism. And it shows you in so many ways why and where black people sit in the social and economic structures. And it's highlighted that beyond any doubt. And in even the government's report, was just painful to watch them slowly, bit by bit, release, say, do this, acknowledge that, as far as they did. I think I would like tonight to talk about where we think internally what the role of the left is for Keirism. I think, look, there are going to be people on the left who are going to want to shake a stick at the project, who are going to want to shout and scream. I think there's a role for that, if I'm honest, to kind of push, to cajole the leadership. But there's also a role for the left that want to ensure that the right of the party doesn't run away. Because I think this isn't so much now about the legacy of Corbynism. It's more a fight for the soft left, that I think. And I think which direction it takes. At the moment, they're better organized. Labour to Win, I think, is the kind of new project. It's resourced, it's financed. It's a kind of bringing together of Labour First, Labour Progress and others. And I think the battle now, and this is some work I'm doing with some other Labour MPs, is to try and build a counterbalance to what they're doing to make sure that this Keirism doesn't have any form. I think the leadership will acknowledge that. It's stumbling from issue to issue. It doesn't really have, I'm not talking about policy, I'm talking about strategy and direction and culture. And I think there's a fight inside the shadow cabinet. I think bizarrely, and not bizarrely, but I think Ed Miliband is the person, one of those people holding the line on things like environment policy, which I'm sure we'll hear from Assad in a minute. And that tells you a lot. So I think that the overwhelming balance of forces on the front bench and in the shadow cabinet inside the Labour Party now is on the right. And I think that's a problem. And I think the analysis that Keir and those around him, the project, whatever it is Blairite, is wrong. They're not. They're soft left. But they have the potential to go in the wrong direction. If they go in the wrong direction, then I think what comes after Keir, if he stumbles, I think at the moment, there's no guarantee he'll win, could well be worse than Keir and Keirism. And that will mean that the left will end up in a tomb. And we will be set back. And we will just be about managing capitalism. This project has the potential to be about that, but we have to drive it out. So I think there's a role for the left as well to constructively engage in this project and try and put it back. A final thing I will say...
I've got to start getting you to come to an end.
The final thing I would say is that, and that's it. I've finished. I'll shut up. There you go.
Thanks, Clive. No, it's really, it's difficult because everyone on this call has got such interesting things to say. And it is such an important time to be honest with ourselves, be honest about the challenges that lie ahead, to be honest about what's going on in the Labour Party, and to be honest with ourselves about where things have gone wrong in the past and where we need to build. And obviously, Clive, you're in the middle of it. So thank you so much for joining us and for being so open about what we need to do now and the efforts we need to put in. I'm going to go to Sarah Woolley. Sarah Woolley is the newly, I think, when did you start? June, General Secretary of the Bakers Union. And I'd really like, Sarah, for you to pick up on this point that Gary and Satbir and Clive to some extent have raised around the multi-ethnic working class. Your members, of course, as people in the food industry, will be disproportionately Black and brown. And just to remind us about what's going on, to tell us about what's going on at that level, and to talk about how the trade union is organising and fighting back. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Faiza. I'm going to touch on some of the impacts of COVID on the wider kind of union membership, and then talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing in setting up BAME networks as well, if that's okay. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me along to speak tonight. You know, we've got such a fantastic platform, and I was listening to Clive speak then, thinking, please don't bring me in afterwards. How do I follow that? But you did, and here we are. And our members, so our members in the Bakers Union, you're right, we've got such a diverse membership, and predominantly low paid, and in the main have worked throughout the pandemic, feeding the nation, and quite rightly have been recognised as the key essential workers that we've always known that they are. Others, like our members in Greggs and fast food and Wetherspoons, are just returning to work after a long period of furlough, with many receiving a fifth less of the wages that they would have under normal circumstances, not to mention the loss of tips and bonuses on top. And that has had a massive impact on some of them, and how they've been able to kind of get through this whole pandemic. And this means that going forward, we've got a number of challenges as a trade union. The first is to ensure that those that are returning to customer-facing roles are kept safe. You know, there's been some fantastic work at Greggs, for example, ensuring that they've spoken to our members, they've spoken to us as a trade union, they've put social distancing measures in place, they've recognised where the hotspots are, they've changed the ways of working, including reducing opening hours and the ranges, and given the power to the shops to close them if there's an influx of customers or if they don't feel safe, which is really important, because that gives the power to the person, in that employee, to say, I don't feel safe in my workplace, you know, we're shutting up the shop. Others haven't, you know, the other fast food companies, they would have us believe, like McDonald's, that their workplaces are safer than safe, but in reality they're not. You know, we've had stories of back-to-back working, no social distancing, even of workers collapsing, and you know, many stories about people that have gone back to work because they felt pressured to do so, and because they're so behind in the rent and the bills and the utility payments and things, that they've no option to go back to work and put themselves, their families and the colleagues at risk. With Wetherspoons opening up at the weekend, there's also issues there, like the others, with regards to social distancing, but they've got the added complication of the alcohol and the effect that has on people, both, you know, social distancing out of the window because they've had a drink and they're celebrating, but also the reaction to the staff within Wetherspoons. That on top of the wishy-washy inconsistent guidance and the proposed business and planning bill that's coming into play and being discussed, that are all purely designed to maximise revenue opportunities in businesses to help the economy, but doesn't seem to focus on people's health and safety, or even, you know, the impact of COVID on them as individuals. Is just, it's mind-blowing, and it doesn't help the work that we've got to do as trade unions. And through this, we've contacted McDonald's and Wetherspoons throughout the pandemic, asking them to work with us to ensure our members, their employees are safe. We recognise, you know, fast food workers, there is a disproportionate amount of BAME workers in that industry, and we want to make sure that they're safe. You know, we know that we have some of the best trained health and safety reps in the movement. I know Kevin's here from the NEU, but ours are definitely better than theirs. And they have been an asset to workplaces throughout this. You know, we've seen such a small number of people that have unfortunately passed away from the virus, but without our health and safety measures reps challenging companies and challenging bad practice, that number would have been so much higher. But we've had no response from them. Our fast food organisers throughout the pandemic, though, have been in constant contact with members and potential members through WhatsApp and by holding Zoom meetings, talking to them about the rights, educating them about the importance of risk assessments, having access to them, challenging bad practice and the importance of joining the Bakers Union so that they're ready when they go back into the workplace. Those that have worked through the pandemic, the bulk of our members have seen their workplaces change throughout, becoming safer and working in what is their new way going forwards. We need to make sure, though, that there's no kind of slackening off of those extra measures. in place, because as openings continue and people start, you know, treating life as though we're going back to normal, we don't want to see any more outbreaks like we've seen in Leicester and Wales and other places, because our members, if that happens, will be directly at risk. And we know that once this pandemic subsides, which could be months away depending on whether we have a second wave, the crisis is going to continue for our members. Whilst those stayed open, producing food, generally saw a boom in demand through the panic buying stages of the pandemic, they also saw absence levels skyrocket, sometimes hitting 30-35% absence, which is absolutely massive. And at those levels, sick pay far exceeded their planned budgets, as we've been told a number of times, which will have repercussions going forward. And don't forget, this is an industry that's extremely low paid with precarious contracts. For those companies where the majority of staff are furloughed, whilst government support has been there, companies like Greggs topped up all of their employees' wages and didn't follow the cap guidelines. So they've incurred those costs even though they've not had the customers coming in. And others, even Wetherspoons, have still had bills to pay whilst closed, and they're all coming back to lower volume levels, reduced customer levels, and we'll have to juggle things to stay afloat. And this means that going forwards, we're going to have an uphill battle next year and possibly even the year after with wage negotiations and making sure that our members don't fall to the national minimum wage levels, because nobody can survive on £8.72. And we also need to ensure that we don't see a massive redundancies as a result of our industry struggling, not only to kind of survive through this low volume, but at the end of furlough. We've already seen the impact that it's had on Adeli Foods, Percy Ingalls, and the latest announcement this week from Pret a Manger, and we've begun to arm our reps and officials with the necessary information around how to look at company accounts, what to look for in terms of furlough, so they go in armed, making sure our members don't bear the brunt of the costs of COVID to the business. Something else we've been working on for a few years has been engaging young workers, and this was on the back of a motion to our national conference which called for a young members seat in our executive. Over the years we've held forums and had a specific young members conference which has seen a rise in young activists, including myself. I attended them, and we've done a lot of work over the last couple of years around climate change, engaging our members and the young ones specifically around why it's a trade union issue. But this work has really amplified over the last 3 to 4 years with the fast food campaign, which has drawn into the union new diverse young members who are empowered to stand together collectively to demand change, not only in their workplace, but their communities too. At the beginning of the pandemic, a group of these members sparked a national outcry by outing Tim Martin's shocking attitude towards furloughing his staff, which forced him to U-turn his position. And from there, they, like many others, have been angered by the actions that have led to the death of George Floyd and set up their own BAME committee. They're holding a Zoom rally on the 19th of July to support the SEIU's Strike for Black Lives action on the 20th of July. And this work, alongside the union's wider BAME network that we've set up and started working on, we feel will help us as a union identify the barriers that are in place for working class multi-ethnic people, both young and old, from joining our union, as it would be wrong as me as a General Secretary, as a white woman, to decide what I think those problems are, to action them. It needs to come from the people that are facing them day in, day out, and they need to educate us so that we can tackle and remove them, alongside educating the wider membership around institutional racism and what it looks like. Why, as a white person, we have a privilege that even if we're on low pay and 0 hours contracts, we can't necessarily see it. There's still that privilege there, because we know in the union movement there's a massive issue with that understanding. So we want to work on that. And we're hoping that the BAME network and the guys in the fast food committee can help us with that, so that we become a fully inclusive, anti-racist trade union that truly reflects the diverse industry that we work in. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And, you know, I was just thinking there, listening to you, of course, the exploitation of workers, in which you talk about, and we heard a lot about that in terms of the Boohoo factories in Leicester, and, you know, again, disproportionately Black and brown people being exploited at every turn. And one of the things that has been really clear from COVID is that not only did it expose inequality, but it's making it worse. So when we look at who are the first people sent back to work, you know, construction workers, now people in the fast food industry, you know, those office workers are still being told to work at home. So it's this double-edged thing. It's both a money issue and an income issue, but also an issue of health. And so there's this horrific double-edged sword for the working class. And I keep saying this, I keep saying the multi-ethnic working class, because one of the things that probably frustrates me most is that given everything that's happened and how we've seen who key workers are and what they look like, we still have this idea of the working class being white, and we're not hearing enough from political leaders and our trade unions on the multi-ethnic working class, so that we can finally get into the psyche of this country, that the people doing the work are migrants, are people of colour, and are their white comrades as well. And so it's really good to hear that, Sarah, from you on what you're doing to raise consciousness and build solidarity across those in the Bakers Union. I'm just really aware of time. I've been very bad at chairing this because so many interesting people and interesting subjects to talk about. I'm going to turn to Kevin. And Kevin Courtney, who's the General Secretary of the NEU, which I think has had a really interesting few months and has been really the leading light on standing up to government and making sure that they do protect workers, and have seen a massive boost in membership as a consequence. So I'm hoping, Kevin, you can give us some tips on what we should be doing at this time, but also what's worked at NEU and how we can use that organising spirit in other parts of the movement. Thanks, Kevin. Wait, I think you're still muted. 1 second.
There. Is that better? Oh, sorry. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Am I okay now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry about that. I'm really pleased to be on this platform, really pleased to be following Sarah, who's a fantastic addition to the cadre of General Secretaries of the Trades Union Movement. So like Faiza said, we've had an interesting few months, and I want to talk about the centrality of organising at the workplace to what we've done, because you might have seen us being on the news, but the only reason we were on the news is that we were organised at the workplace. And for me, I think that we have, and I want to say some stuff about Black Lives Matter and the ways we're trying to use organising at the workplace to build into that issue. But I think centrally for me, our union has tried to have a moral high ground. We've tried to talk about the whole of society and the reaction to the crisis. We've also really tried to talk about the science and to say, we're not the scientists, but we want scientists to speak. And we've been trying to do grassroots mobilizing at the same time. So the moral high ground part of it is, at the start of the crisis, we didn't call for schools to close. We called for them to remain open to the children of key workers and vulnerable kids. And we were urging our members who weren't vulnerable to be in school to help our society through the crisis. And at the same time, we were saying our members who were vulnerable could be making their contribution from home, educating kids who were at home. So it was a useful, conflux of things. There were lots of kids at home, so the vulnerable staff could be at home. And we do think that the work we've done has kept many of our vulnerable members safe during this period while the virus levels are falling off. And we think that's been really important. But like I say, it's been us using the head office machinery to turn around policy documents, checklists, getting those out to reps to use at the workplace, and always us going to reps saying, you need to talk to members at the workplace, then you need to go and see the head teacher, then you need to raise what you want to happen at a school level. And we've said things nationally, but they haven't bit unless people have raised them at school level. And we have had, we think, some real successes from that. So Faiza said we've got 20,000 more members, and that's a significant increase in membership for us. But I think much more importantly, we've gained 3,500 new workplace reps. And that's the real gain that will lead to more members in the long term. And I think that's happening because of that orientation towards the workplace. And I think people have come to us because they think we've been successful. And there's a moment about this that we have to be a bit careful about. When I'm asked on the media why our schools aren't open and Denmark's schools are, I don't say that's because of the success of the union. I don't think that's the fundamental reason. The fundamental reason our schools aren't open is our government has mismanaged this crisis so badly. They went into lockdown a week, a fortnight, 3 weeks too late. So the peak was far too high. And I'm saying peak, I mean, tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to die, but the peak was far too high, and it takes a long time to come off the peak. Whereas Denmark went into lockdown much sooner. Its peak was a lot shallower. And not only that, but our government has been mismanaging education, running it down, cutting funds for ages, so that our classes, our primary class sizes, are the biggest in Europe. And that obviously, when you start going back with social distancing, you can't get back. So that's the fundamental reason our schools aren't open. But I do think the union's role has meant that schools haven't opened when it was unsafe to do so. And members appreciate the work that we've done on that. So we've recruited 20,000 new members. We've got 3,500 new reps, which is much more important. And we want to work with those on both the economic that people were talking about before, but also on what we educate in school and, you know, what we're doing with the kids in school. And we have found during the crisis that we can use these new technologies in ways we hadn't anticipated before, and that there have been opportunities in it. So we've had a Zoom call with 20,000 people on the Zoom call, with me and Mary, my co-general secretary, doing a lead off and then getting reps to talk about what they've done in school. But 20,000 people on a call is an astonishing thing to be able to do. And it gives you an opportunity to try and shape what people are doing in every school in the country at the same time. And then we were thinking, well, you know, how can we use this in other ways? And so when George Floyd was then brutally murdered, we've got a black educators network in the union. We use the word black. We don't use BAME in the NEU. So we're using black in that sense that the Americans use people of color. It means Afro-Caribbean and Asian as far as we're concerned. So when I'm talking about that, that's what I mean, and that's what our Black Educators Network has settled its mind on. But after that, we thought there were opportunities to talk, because it wasn't just George Floyd, which is so terrible, outrageous, and transparent, but in the way that Gary talked about earlier on, the fact that those pictures of doctors dying in this country being so predominantly black meant that it's not just that racism of the direct racism of the police, it's also all those other bits of racism, being on the worst shifts, being often being in the, you know, having the worst PPE, and being from often challenging, poorer backgrounds to begin with, all those things. And so we thought, can we do a Zoom call like the 20,000? And we had 8,000 people on a Zoom call that I was on, but the Reverend Jesse Jackson and Diane Abbott and other black reps from our schools talking about what they'd done in their schools. And I hope that we can find a way, working with our black educators, to keep the momentum of that going. So we've written to government saying there needs to be action on there aren't enough black teachers, black support staff, black head teachers in our schools. The curriculum doesn't match what we need to be giving to our children. Exclusions are much higher for black kids than for white kids. They're also high for white kids from the working class, as well as for black kids. But I'm sorting one out, I think, would help to sort both out. But it's outrageous, the excess exclusions of black kids. And that leads to lots of other problems in lives. We've just launched an anti-racist framework, and that's all good stuff that we're doing nationally. But the thing that's really excited me at the moment is that we have then had calls, Zoom calls of 100, 150, 200 people in local branches, where they've set up calls to talk about decolonizing the curriculum, which is the sort of jargon way we're talking about it. But hundreds of people coming together saying they're already doing something on this in their primary school or in their bit of the English curriculum, and wanting to talk to other people about how they can do it. So if we can use this to develop networks of teachers who want to talk critically about the work they do with their children, and specifically on the issue of decolonization of the curriculum, and a curriculum that's more appropriate for all of our kids, but for our Black kids in particular, then there's a real moment in that for us. And the other exciting thing to me was on that call of 8,000 people, 850 of them volunteered to become reps. So our organizing team is now going through getting back in touch with all those 850 people, because if we can turn those people, and they're not, that call wasn't all Black people, but a lot of them were, and a lot of those 850 would be Black people. And that's just such, we have a lot of Black reps in the union, but we don't have as many as we'd like to have. And there's a real opportunity. And if we can find some way of keeping that momentum going, developing teachers and support staff working together on those sorts of things, I think that would be fantastic. There's something about, I'll just say this as a last thing, if I've got a moment, that bringing down the statue of Colston, or John Cass Foundation in Tower Hamlets is going to change its name. That's a good thing. He was another slaver, but we shouldn't just let the school management change the name, or the trust change the name. We should insist it's debated with the children. Where did this guy's money come from to set up this foundation? Where is, what do we think about where that money came from? What do we think the conclusion should be today? There is a real chance to involve kids in a political debate, rather than just letting somebody change the symbol without you even knowing that the symbol's been changed. So yeah, thanks very much.
Wow, thank you, Kevin. And that was, wow, I just, it's amazing to hear what's going on there. And I guess that work of organising, of standing up for teachers and standing up for your members, so that they feel that they want to get more involved. And also the point about bringing in the Black Lives Matter and the historic curriculum stuff. I have a friend who's a teacher who said that a group of teachers, and they're NEU members as well, he's quite a new member, they're organising at their school now to do Black History Month in a completely different way. So, given that education and changing the curriculum is not going to happen with the kind of Tory government we have right now, this is the way to do it, really, through teachers pushing at the grassroots level. So thank you for that, and thank you for giving us that sense of where hope can come from and where change can come from, even with the type of government that we have right now. I'm going to come to Amru now, and Amru, I just want to start by saying this, that class doesn't always get a kind of LGBTQI voice or queer voice on our calls, but something that has really struck me in the last couple of years is how much worse aspects of transphobia have got. And we know that Dominic Cummings used transphobia as an issue, and the Gender Recognition Act as an issue, to wind people up in the north of the country. He did focus groups on this particular issue. And so, I think for us on the left, we haven't always been as open, and I really wanted to have you on this call today. I mean, partly because you're my friend and I think you're amazing, but also because, and because we were talking about your incredible interview with on Channel 4 with the, what's it called? Change? Anyway.
Ways to change the world.
Ways to change the world, and your incredible way of bringing in physics and being non-binary. And I just want to open it up to you. I know that you've got a lot of thinking around climate and capitalism, as well as where this fits into everything that's happening on gender and identity. So I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Faiza, for having me, and also for providing me with these clothes as a birthday present. So thank you so much. What I'd like to talk about today is actually following on from some of what Clive was saying about the space for progressives within the Labour Party. I'm at the moment having sort of daily conversations with fellow non-binary and trans Labour Party members who are really heavily considering rescinding their membership, if they haven't already. I myself have decided to keep mine because I'd like to shift the party as much as I can to the left, although I'm still trying to figure out what the strategies are there. But this is a real source of kind of crisis for a lot of LGBT members in the Labour Party, because Keir's ambivalence to the GRA, not reforming the GRA, which was Liz Truss's decision, and Keir's is saying, oh, we need to listen to all sides equally. We're seen, similarly to what Gary was saying in terms of his comments on BLM, like a sort of shirking of the history of transphobia, where it comes from, and a kind of feeling that he hasn't listened to any of the kind of basic concerns of trans people. But before I get to that, I actually today really wanted to sort of focus on culture wars and the left, and why we have to engage with them, like Clive was saying as well, because they are really, really sort of sucking out our political oxygen and distracting us from the right's malign political projects. So I'd like to think a little bit about how can we engage with culture wars in a productive way that might take us out of them. Given we're going to be talking about climate change, I was actually remembering this week when I was preparing for today, the Question Time episode after the last Extinction Rebellion demonstrations in the UK. And one of the leaders of the movement, Dr. Rupert Reed, was invited on the panel. And like, I was excited that we would have some of the sobering facts of climate breakdown on BBC One. But the framing of the climate issue that night was, has Extinction Rebellion gone too far? And so rather than discussing meaningful strategies for decarbonizing our economy and the jobs this might offer whilst reducing inequality, poor Dr. Reed was immediately placed in a defensive position where he was forced to shout back and engage in a culture war debate about the ethics of protesting, thereby shoving the granular questions of climate change under the carpet. And then it was the perfect example of how the mainstream media are able to give airtime to an urgent topic through effectively ridiculing it and therefore nullifying it. And it's really easy for us on the left to take the bait because we so urgently need mainstream platforms. For everyone listening, Nesrin Malik talks about this far more eloquently than I ever could in her wonderful book, We Need New Stories. Where with flair and painstaking detail, she charts how culture wars and this mythological crisis of free speech are active strategies by the right. There are even instances, proven instances we have, where right-wing organizations have funded training for fake experts to go onto programs to literally act like enraged snowflake lefties, thus to further fuel right-wing depictions of leftist issues as one based on kind of irrational rage. And look, I myself have very much got ensnared in this. Like, as a non-binary person, I've only ever been invited to discuss transgender issues within the context of a debate where I have an opponent who, for the sake of BBC fairness, believes that trans people are not real. So it's not really a debate. Instead of discussing the fact that there is an 81% increase of trans hate crimes last year, or the fact that 2 in every 5 trans people in the UK have been victim to violence, or the fact that nearly half of all trans people in Britain have attempted suicide, and how we might reform our health services in order to accommodate what is by any description a vulnerable minority, all we're ever invited to do, and this is what Keir, I think, was sadly endorsing, was engaging in this debate rather than defending the defenseless. He used that false equivalence. And I want to talk about that a little bit, because part of the media trap, and this is where I'm worried that the Labour Party is somehow succumbing to, has been to present trans lives as a debate with 2 equal sides. And it is a false equivalence because conservative estimates suggest that trans people make up just 0.3 to 0. So that's my puppy making noise. Transgender people make up 0.3 to 0.6% of the population, which means that cisgender people make up, over 99%. And as you were saying, Faiza, the positioning of trans lives as a debate has been such an effective tool for the right that the nation's least favorite maniac, Dominic Cummings, was polling how effective transphobia would be as a culture war for a Tory victory in 2019. And this debate has particularly torn the British left apart. Prominent feminists, many who would have their natural home on the left and have actually been long life left-wing campaigners, have been distracted massively from the real issues at play: climate breakdown, Donald Trump and a new fascism, the rise of abortion restrictions in America, no deal Brexit, disaster capitalism. And instead, they're harnessing all their critical energy on debating the validity and rights of a tiny percentage of the population who pose no harm to them, a minority who, starved of social protections, should naturally find their home on the left, but who are also increasingly feeling disenfranchised from the left because of a perception of Keir Starmer as someone who wants to hear the transphobic position out as if it's coming from good faith. And then the longer this debate goes on, the more hardened the cultured war positions were. If we've learned anything about culture wars, is there's hardly any compromise and people just stake that. So what's the road to recovery? I wish I knew, I'm not going to pretend I know it all. But for me, the answer must lie in how we get out of a culture war narrative in which minorities are faced with their opponent under a bad faith fair debate platform. And so in thinking about kind of alternative strategies for progressive voices or alternative spaces, I'm someone who's lucky enough to have a job writing screenplays for TV. And more I've found storytelling to be an effective way to engage in a polemic without having to engage in the culture war sort of scaffolding of a polemic. In showing queer and trans characters of color as complicated humans in narratives that never questions their humanity, one hopes empathy, even from those on the other side of the political spectrum, will generate. And as someone with a platform in TV, I'm having lots of exciting conversations with broadcasters and commissioners at the moment. And I really do think there's going to be a major push to allow minority voices to tell their own stories without anyone screaming back. And I'm hoping that will get us out of minority, quote unquote, issues having to be presented within the debate format that I think particularly the BBC feels it has to honor when it comes to debating anything, to hopefully give some humanity to minorities who are feeling disenfranchised on the left. And as these new stories surface over the next 4 years, in the meantime, I hope Keir Starmer and the Labour Party stop, like I've said, to just not engage with the culture war at all, but they need to make the point that not all sides are getting a fair play. Indeed, they need to do their own storytelling in making the case for trans rights in a way that isn't polemical, but that just narrates the reality for trans people in the UK. Never debating them, but just telling their stories and showing their humanity through their own voices. Though I am very aware that to have more effective social media strategies, we maybe need to move away from the meal deal meme we saw yesterday, which was a bit of a flop on all counts. But yeah, so I mean, in the short term, I really think we need to find a way to extract ourselves from the rules of the culture wars that have been set up for the right. Because I've found in all engagements, whenever I've gone on TV, whenever I've gone to discuss these issues, they're bad faith debates, which are constructed to present the left as screaming snowflakes, and they don't engage with us on our own terms. So I think we need to find our own platforms. And for me, that's going to be, hopefully more TV that shows our stories in a human light. And Sitting in Limbo was a great example of drama that looked at the Windrush. And, apparently so many people called in and wrote. I was speaking to the commissioner, even Tory voters saying they had no idea. So that's where I personally am going to be trying to use my platform, but I'd be keen to discuss what other ways we can get out of the culture war.
Great, thank you, Anne-Marie. Thank you so much for that, and really bringing in that really important aspect of the way in which the media works and stories are told. And that point about humanizing right? And I think this is definitely true for immigrants, and it's true of working class Black and brown people too. And you know, as many stories as we can get that don't play into stereotypes, but actually humanize people, that helps to shift public thinking. I'm just gonna finally come to Asad Rahman, and thank you for everyone for still being on the call. I mean, I think, just to say, I'm gonna come back to everyone, just so if everyone's ready, just for like a 1 minute kind of, sort of what you're taking from this call, listening to sort of a broad range of people working across, but just really emphasizing on what people on the call, so I think we had about 150 or 200 people on this call, what you want people on the call to do, and just to keep it brief. So I'm going to come back to everyone at the end, but I'm going to come to Asad Rahman, who does lots of work on climate and internationalism, and is a real hero. He's the director of 111. Asad.
Thank you.
If you want to try and summarize a bit, that the whole conversation, that would really help me. Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, always an honor to be on such an amazing panel, and it just got me thinking, you know, what is the story that the left is telling, right, in this moment of multiple crisis? And because I think we all say, okay, look at COVID. COVID's exposed, it's been like an X-ray on our societies, exposed all the racial, economic, gender inequalities. This is a result of decades of neoliberal policies. But, you know, what I've always been struck about as part of our story is, of course, we tell the story within the nation state. And, you know, when you start telling the story from a global perspective, we know, well, the reality for the global south is we've suffered centuries of economic exploitation, from slavery, colonialism, imperialism to neoliberalism. And COVID is just the last stage, latest example of what I call racialized capitalism, you know, and this logic of sacrificing the global south in the interests of the economies of the global north. And, you know, when you think just over the last decades of the unfair trade rules, the structural adjustment programs, the debt crisis, forced privatization, and how that gutted the economies of the global south and left them without the tools that the global north has been able to use to respond to protect its citizens and its economies. And we all know that in the last few months, sort of neoliberal economies have ripped up the economic rule book in terms of their interventions. And of course, we're not happy with the scale of their interventions, but it has been very interesting. And of course, you know, there's a lot of things that we could talk about, right? That we could talk about the fact that, you know, on average, there's 28 doctors per 10,000 in the global north. It is 0.04% in Sierra Leone. Why? Because we gutted Sierra Leone's public services. We insisted on a massive cut to their public expenditure. We insisted on privatizing their health service. And this moment that we're in, this profound moment, what I call like the permanent crisis for people of the global south, or black and brown people, you know, of course, is just the latest. You know, climate is, you know, off the front pages of the newspapers at the moment. But the reality of this climate apartheid, you know, where it's clear that the logic of the rich countries is going to be, well, we're wealthy enough to be able to protect and adapt to the ongoing climate emergency, and the poor are going to be left to face killer floods, droughts and famines. And, you know, when we think about the scale of that, you know, one storm in the global south has wiped out development gains for a whole generation, where, you know, the cyclone in Mozambique left the country unable to meet the needs of 1 million of its citizens who were left hungry, and Mozambique had to come to the city of London to beg for more debt-creating loans. And I remember the stories of climate. You know, when I first got involved, the story of climate was this bloody white polar bear on a white iceberg, right? The story of climate was black and brown people up to their neck in water, you know, powerless and without agency, and not the story of the resistance that people have had in the global south, the work that people have done in terms of trying to say that climate has never been an environmental issue. It's fundamentally been an issue of racial capital, of racial injustice, of the political economy, and how it amplifies all the other existing inequalities that exist there for people in the global south, from hunger, poverty to inequality. And, you know, and when we think about this moment, I mean, again, you know, I look at the conversation around, you know, we have to build back, you know, well, of course, there is a very different conversation to building back in the global north to the building back in the global south. You know, what are they building back to? Where half the world's population live on less than $5 a day, and that hasn't changed at all since 1990, despite all of the interventions by the so-called philanthropy and international NGOs who fail to deal with the root causes and structural reality of our global economy. Does it deal with the fact that, you know, 2 billion people still face hunger? You know, 3.5 billion people don't have access to electricity and clean cooking. And when we look at what's coming, you know, the global recession that's coming, of course, it's going to be devastating for working people here in the UK and the global north. But it's predicted that half of all jobs in the global south will go. You know, that another 420 million people are going to be pushed into extreme poverty of living on less than $1.25. And I was struck that in the midst of the corona pandemic, you know, social media was full of like these pictures of deers and boars and ducks and saying, nature is recovering. Look at this. This is the upside of the corona lockdown. Whilst, you know, migrant workers in India were walking thousands of kilometers and literally starving to death. Yes, so how and what the left tells this story, I think is a really critical issue. And of course, we're in this moment where weirdly the right is adopting a lot of the language of green, right? So Rishi and Sunak talks about the green stimulus. Boris talks about Build Back Better. The first summit to talk about the global economic recovery is a green stimulus recovery. The European Union talks about the largest green stimulus package that it's ever had. And of course, the reality is what they're talking about is a new form of green capitalism. If we look at what the bailouts have done, where the money is going, what they haven't addressed, of course, is the reality of the climate crisis. And I think the left also hasn't. You know, if you think about, for example, you know, even from the climate perspective, the reality of keeping temperatures well below 1.5, if we were serious about that and not relying on unproven technologies, would be that the UK's fair share would have to be a zero by 2030, and would have to also transfer at least $1 trillion just to meet its own mitigation costs, right, of its own fair share, not for adaptation, not for loss and damage. That's not part of anybody's conversation. If we talk about how people talk about, well, we have to rebuild our economy to be greener, nobody talks about the resource extraction and the impacts to the global south. The OECD says that, you know, we're at about 79 billion tons of material resources each year now. That's going to increase to about 167 billion. That's a 150% increase in metal extraction, 135% increase in mineral extraction. And where is that coming from? It's coming from the very communities that are being most devastated by environmental justice and economic inequality. I wish I should have shared my screen. There's like an incredible 4 maps that I looked at and pulled together. If you look at the map of like the world and put, you know, sort of, and I use the word black in a political term, put black people from around the world, then overlay it with climate violence, then overlay that with economic inequality, and overlay that with COVID impacts, you see one thing happening. You see an exact correlation that these are multiple crises being faced by the poorest and most vulnerable. So, and then we have this big moment, of course, of Black Lives Matter. And for those of us who came from the anti-racist movement in the 80s, it's been like quite an incredible moment. You know, all the things we ever said, people are now willing to talk about it, talking about systems of oppression and institutional racism. And then we're struck by this moment of like, either we're going down a rabbit hole of race awareness training, of like unconscious bias, which reminds me of race awareness training in the 80s when we talked about we need to build an anti-racist society and people talked about multiculturalism, or we talk about that kicking over the statues is like the pinnacle of what we're achieving. And of course, it's great to see those statues come down. But the reality of slavery and colonialism wasn't an experience of the past. It's the reality of now. Yes, we looted 8 billion from enslaving 1.5 million African people for slavery and invested it into every brick and mortar of this country. But we also stripped out 16 trillion from the global south since 1980 in resource flows to the global north, and 4.5 trillion in debt, in unsustainable debt repayments. So it brings me to the big question, like, what should the left be doing? And I think part of what the left needs to be doing is we need to rebuild internationalism. I'm struck by how internationalism has totally disappeared from the left's discourse. we have retreated into the nation state, right? So the response, we know that each crisis brings a profound change in the world, not all for the good. If you look back at 1929, yeah, we can see FDR has the New Deal, and then at the same time, the rise of fascism. You look at the 1970s oil and food debt crisis, the rise of neoliberalism. 2008, the austerity and the rise of the populist right. And the question we as the left have got to answer is, what is the multiple crises of 2020 going to lead us to? So I think we have a moment for the left to craft a new story that brings together economic inequality, racial justice, migrant justice, climate into one narrative, and talk about, be able to talk about the vision of the future. The left can't describe the world that we want people to follow us into. And until we can, we'll never be able to build a social license. And of course, it's great that at some level, Build Back Better has been able to do the thing that none of us have argued for a long time. You can't win social license for transformation for climate until you tackle economic inequality in this country. But we're doing it, of course, at the expense of other people around the world. And, you know, the left's mantra was never workers of England unite or workers of Britain unite. It was always workers of the world unite. And so it's great, Sarah and the Bakers Union and the SEIU trying to connect fast food workers around the world. It's great that people are trying to make, you know, connect labour struggles around the world. But I think we've got to avoid going back into a silo fight. So the labour fight is separate from the Black Lives Matter fight, is separate from the climate fight, is separate from and bring those together. And how can we do that? Well, I think we can bring together some universal political demands. I mean, the fight around, for example, a basic income, as social protection, universal public services and workers' rights is a demand for the UK labour movement, and it's a demand for the global labour movement, and it's a demand for all people in the world. We have to talk about food and energy as a public good. I think we have to talk about political education. We don't educate our own movement enough, both of the historical movements and of the present, and we don't make the right political demands. And at the centre is the idea of solidarity and internationalism. Sorry, Faiza.
No, thank you, Asad. And we desperately wanted you on the call because we knew you would bring that internationalism in. And, you know, this is a different type of event for class in the sense that we have brought in people from the trade union movement, people, you know, thinking much more about race and immigration. And we brought in yourself, brought in Amru, and because we really do think that this is a time when we need to stick together and stand together. And we really do need to unite our struggles and tell a new story, like you said. So just to round up, and I know I'm going to go a little bit over now, but I guess we'll finish just 10 minutes late. I'm just going to give a quick minute to everyone to just, all of the speakers, just to say what they're taking from this call, and in particular about the ways in which our struggles are united, and the struggle and the way in which they see these issues overlap, and what they want people on the call to do and where they think they should focus. And Satbir, just to say, there was a specific question to you around how many are in the situation you talked about in terms of recourse and no recourse to public funds. Thanks.
So on the specifics of NRPF, it's hundreds of thousands. There's at least 200,000 children. The numbers are probably over 1 million of people who are affected by no recourse to public funds. The Prime Minister asked the Home Secretary Preeti Patel to count to find out how many, and I'm confident that she will do that really quickly because friend of migrants that she is. If you can pick up the sarcasm there. Really quickly to sort of my takeaway, there's 3 threads right now that this discussion centered on: the climate crisis, a pandemic that, you know, as a country we've failed to fight properly, and in which some groups of people have been put at far greater risk of death and destitution and loss than others, and, you know, global awakening, a long overdue awakening in some parts of the world on racial justice, and all 3 were a long time coming, and all 3 of them are really intimately connected. The solutions being offered to all 3 of them are insufficient. You know, with one hand, we're being offered a discount at Nando's, and with the other hand, the government wants us to tear out each other's hair over issues about statues, to force, as Amru was saying, people on the left to appear as if we're hysterical, to appear as if the demands that we're making are not central to any conception of justice. And the way that we get out of that is the conversation that we have going forward is one that brings all of these together. We can't talk about the rights of the worker, justice for the worker after the pandemic without also talking about the specific racialized injustices in the workplace. We can't talk about racial injustice without talking about the class structuring of racial injustices. People in their movements, people on this call who go back to their community groups, your unions, to your organizing groups, whichever of these issues you're talking about, make sure you're centering the others in that conversation, because that's where we will start to develop a new conversation for the left and a new story that the left is telling about where we go after this crisis.
Great, thank you, Satbir. A little bit over. I'm trying to be a little bit stricter on time. Gary.
I was particularly struck by Kevin's point that he was called onto the news because of the organising, that we don't organise through the media, certainly not through somebody else's media. We organise on our own basis, and if the media are interested, then great. I am struck by, and this, is organised by class. So I'm hoping that this is a acceptable person to quote here, but quote from Lenin, who said that capitalists can buy themselves out of any crisis so long as they make the workers pay. And that's what they did with the last economic crisis. The bankers frittered money away, and then they said, and then they blamed it on migrants and public sector workers. And we can't let that happen again. And so I think we have to, we're in a fight for a narrative that it is easier, and this is an original thought, but it is easier for many people to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism as we know it. And we have to be able to turn that around. And actually, the moment that we've just come out of actually makes that more possible rather than less. We've been queuing up for toilet paper and, standing, all sorts of things we have seen are possible. I'm not trying to, put a cherry on top of what has been a very difficult and awful time, but it has taught us some lessons about how we can organize. And I think the central question in this new narrative is, who is this economy for? When they say, but it's bad for the economy, well, whose economy is it? What use is an economy if we're dead? What use is a great economy if we are poor? A black man in DC has a lower level of life expectancy than a man on the Gaza Strip. How useful is it for him to know that the American economy is thriving or doing badly? So who is this economy for? I think that that's a question that we can put squarely in the middle. It works for COVID, it works in terms of Black Lives Matter, and I think it works in terms of climate change.
Great, thanks, Gary. And just to say that we are going to be going through this call and as class and putting together where the story is uniting. It's a job that we've got for over the summer to really think about how we're bringing struggles together. Clive, I don't know, are you still on the call? Can you give us the last thoughts in a couple of minutes?
I can, yes, very much so. And I thought that I think all the contributions tonight were brilliant. But I have to say, I think Assad really nailed it on the head in so many ways about the lack of internationalism. And, I'm looking back at my notes and checking myself. And so often we talk about being caught up in bubbles. But I think one of the things that the Black Lives Matter and the death of George Floyd has done, it's opened up another dimension for a lot of people, and myself included. I've always been aware of Black history and colonialism, and I was brought up with it. And I think what Black Lives Matter have done is they've made a connection for me and many others, I think. And what Assad is talking about really hits the nail on the head. When you look, for example, now at the fact that there is talk that we know this government are not interested in the climate crisis. They believe that it's something which they will be able to weather, and they're not prepared to make the changes that are required, the existential changes that are required, because it's a threat to capitalism. They won't do that. But I think when you begin to see the fact that our own front bench is potentially toying with the idea of backtracking on decarbonisation targets by 2030, and then you look at one of those maps that Asad was talking about, and the fact that disproportionately the number of people, the people who are going to suffer, or where their homes are going to be uninhabitable by 2100 on current climate projections, they are black people, politically black people in South America, in Africa, Asia, India. And that's the reality of the climate crisis. It is racist. And I think one of the reasons why it hasn't moved up the political agenda faster the way it should is because of racism. It's just so obvious. So I think if we are to kind of rebuild that consciousness, then I think now is the time to do that. And I think that's one of the things. The other thing I think very quickly is to stay inside the Labour Party, but also understand the Labour Party is not the be-all and end-all of organisation and progressive politics in this country. You can organise outside of it. And I would argue that with the current leadership, it's even more important to make that political space and pressure outside of the party to push it and keep pushing it in the right direction. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Clive. Sarah?
Thank you. What a meeting. I mean, it's very easy when you sat in your back garden in an office in the rain after being on lockdown for weeks and weeks and weeks to think of all the negative things that are going on in the world. But we've seen tonight some of the fantastic work that's going on by some amazing people that have spoke about it. And I think it's inspirational, and it doesn't matter that it's raining around me. It doesn't matter that it's 20 to 9 on a Thursday night. I'm going to walk out of my office inspired and ready to kind of fight again in the morning. So I just wanted to thank you all for helping with that. I think just touching on what Gary said about who's the economy for, and I attended a number of class seminars, so I'm going to pinch something from them here. The economy is not just this thing that happens. We are the economy. We can remake things how we want, and I think we need to get that narrative out there to people and empower them to want better. And what can people do going forward? I'm going to have a plug here. Talk to people about the importance of being in a trade union, about the importance of collectivism, about the importance of solidarity. Across the board. When you go to the supermarket, talk to the cashier, the person behind the bar at a pub, the member of staff at Greggs. You post it, or the bus driver. It's free. It doesn't require resources, but the impact of having that conversation, that meaningful kind of start about collectivism. I stand in solidarity with you. What can I do to help? Join a trade union is massive for people because it sends them on a journey. It plants that seed in their mind that things can be better and they can be part of that.
Thank you, Sarah. Of course, yeah. I mean, I think there was a lot going around at the beginning of all of this, and issues with safety, with a lot of people saying join a union. And I do think that the numbers overall did go up. I believe that's right from TEC figures. Kevin. Wait, you're still muted, Kevin.
Okay, sorry. I'm just going to agree with Sarah. I think our audiences are in our workplaces, they're in the shops, and they're in the communities. So I think people should join a union. They should organise in their workplace. They should try and organise in their church or their mosque or their synagogue or their tenants association, or if they're a student in school or in university, and then to use that workplace organisation to build for social justice. I think most people in our workplaces have some degree of commitment. They won't be as, they won't have thought about it as much as you've thought about it, but to find the way of trying to mobilize the center of gravity of your workplace or your community, I think there's loads that we can do on that and get people mobilizing into, people will see international concerns cannot be escaped. If the virus is just allowed to run, to have its way in the global south, it will come back. And that's obviously not that's not the only reason why we should want to deal with it. But where no man is an island.
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. And yeah, that point about how the pandemic has been an international struggle and we are all in it. Amru.
Yeah, firstly, just thanks everyone. This has been really inspiring and galvanizing. Yeah, I was actually just thinking, I was talking to, just like to finish up, a trans friend on the left in America, because the left in America don't seem to have as endemic a problem with transphobia as is the case here in Britain. And I was trying to figure out why that was the case when we were discussing it. And, you know, they were saying to me that because there is a real cultural and social awareness of slavery and racist history in America. Obviously, America has its huge racial problems, but a lot of people on the left have had some kind of reckoning with their racial past. And as a result, their thinking, particularly with trans people as well, has always been quite intersectional. This is something that I really experienced just I've had so much fewer instances of racism and transphobia being out in America. And I think maybe part of the reason that the UK is in the position it is with transphobia is because we've not been as actively intersectional in our thinking, because our education has not ever dealt with colonialism in any meaningful way. And as a result, many people on the left or liberals or whatever who think they're socially progressive haven't done any kind of work to decolonize the way that they think. And when you really look at colonial history, you see that transphobia and racism are real bedfellows, because this obsession with kind of sex categorization and basically genitals is really aligned with kind of racial eugenics thoughts that came out through colonialism. And actually colonialism exported a lot of transphobic and homophobic legislation to the global South and South Asia, and those things have erased. So I think going forward, again, I mean, I always think storytelling is really key because of fake news and these culture wars. It's so hard to figure out what's real, that I really think we need to build better stories and narrate the history of Britain and the world in an honest way that allows these intersectional issues to connect the dots. Because I think hopefully what COVID is doing is it's starting to connect the dots between.
Okay. Oh,
Okay.
I don't know what happened. I think Clive.
Anyway, connect the dots.
Yeah, thank you. Cheers, Amaru. I said, I don't know how you feel about having a last minute, because you just spoke at the end bit, and we're very over now. I've just got 1 minute to say at the end. So if you want to just if you've got like, this is very naughty of me because I've given everyone else time, but if you've got just like 2 sentences, that would be great.
I think we have to remember that the response to the corona pandemic was anything but global. It was showed that the response was global north competing against each other for PPE equipment, sacrificing the global south. The global solidarity came from ordinary people. And I think that's the story we have to tell. So yes, we have to rip down the statues, but I'd also like to tell the story of William Coffey. I'd like to tell the story of the Rochdale textile workers. I think we have to put the class back into racial, and we have to put the racial back into class.
Thank you. You can have ended it on a point closer to our work and our hearts at class. And, you know, we do a lot of work on race and class, and because of that way in which things are just divorced. And so intersectionality isn't just about gender and disability and race and class, but it's also the fact that we stay in our bubbles. And we've been really ambitious in this call today to try and break out of that and bring people together, and I hope that people have found that useful. And just to say, as I was saying, you know, it's class's job. We were set up by the unions, and thank you to both NEU and the Bakers Union who support us, and we will be working on an even more ambitious agenda for the left going forward over the summer, and more radical ideas. But alongside that, the thing we keep coming back to, which is the story we have to tell, and a story that is truly inclusive. And thank you, Asad, for reminding us of all of the ways in which we get stuck in our conversations about the UK. And if there's one thing that all of us can go away and do, is whenever I'm presenting or speaking, and all of us on this call will do this all the time, is to keep in mind both different groups and equality groups, but also to keep in mind the global South at this time. So nothing else left for me to do apart from to say thank you, and a huge thank you to the speakers, of which there's so much we've learned and heard from today, and there will be notes and various different things coming out from class off the back of this call. So thank you, and thank you to Lester and Raquel for organising. Yeah, and see you all soon. Thank you. Bye.